the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. At the Singapore summit last week, President Trump announced he would suspend U.S. war games on the Korean Peninsula. Now the Pentagon has followed through, canceling a major military exercise set for August. Speaking to Fox News, National Security Advisor John Bolton said North Korea now faces a decisive and dramatic choice to give up nuclear weapons.
The president made it very clear to Kim Jong-un he faces a decisive, a dramatic choice. Whether after decades of development, North Korea is prepared to give up its nuclear weapons program, its chemical and biological weapons, its ballistic missiles, and turn away from that approach to its international relations. And if it does, can have a very different future.
What
and
do you
if it
think?
Doesn't,
Did they indicate to you, John, that they were willing to do this for the first time in your career?
Well, they've said they would do it, and I think now we'll see Secretary Mike Pompeo and others meeting with them, discussing it with them, and we'll find out soon enough, I think, whether they've made this strategic decision.
Now, that Fox News host's question about North Korea being willing to give up nuclear weapons for the first time was based on a false premise. In talks with the Bush administration, which Bolton served under, North Korea in 2006 agreed to abandon, quote, all nuclear weapons and existing nuclear programs, unquote, and also allow for international inspections. But it was the Bush administration, including Bolton, that effectively killed that agreement. Now, after Singapore, the two sides are trying again. As part of that process, the U.S. says it has identified the first North Korean test site that Kim Jong-un has committed to destroy. Defense Secretary James Mattis will visit South Korea next week for talks with his South Korean counterpart. Joining me is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He is the former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, now a distinguished professor at the College of William and Mary. Welcome, Colonel. Your assessment of the prospects for this process coming to a resolution and seeing North Korea denuclearized. Do you think it's going to happen?
The interview clip you just gave was fascinating. Hearing John Bolton add chemical and biological weapons to what heretofore, as far as I know, has been strictly nuclear program and ballistic missiles associated therewith was very fascinating, because there is no way on this earth that Kim Jong-un or any Kim dynasty member is going to give up all this. They would be foolish to do so because they still have a security problem. That security problem includes Japan, China, and South Korea. So what happened in Singapore was show. It was pure reality TV show. It's what Donald Trump excels in. But unfortunately for America and for China and for Japan and others too, possibly, South Korea most prominently, it was a show that probably won't produce anything but just what Trump wanted it to produce for the moment, and that is to get his name in the Klieg lights and to look like he was doing something positive. Who won this so far is North Korea, clearly. They have given up absolutely nothing, promised only words, which, as you showed, they did in the 2000s. And they have gained quite a bit, to include a cessation of military exercises by South Korea and the United States on the peninsula. And most importantly, what Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, and now Kim Jong-un himself have sought desperately, and now have, international recognition, signaled most dramatically by sitting down in Singapore with the U.S. president. Kim has already made 3 trips to China. So China is already relaxing its sanctions. We have gotten nothing, and North Korea has gotten a great deal. That's what I see so far.
Colonel, I'm surprised to hear this take from you, because you've long been a critic of the U.S. military presence on the Korean Peninsula, including these war games, which Trump called provocative and which have now been suspended. But they've only been suspended temporarily. Trump has said that if there's no progress, he can immediately resume them. And to say that North Korea offered nothing, I mean, even before the summit, they released hostages, they suspended tests, they also destroyed a certain facility. Now, the magnitude of that move has been debated, but some have viewed it as being significant. And now, again, just this week, as I said in the intro, North Korea has, according to U.S. officials, has identified the site that it will, the nuclear testing site, which is related to ballistic missiles, that it will destroy.
It had already destroyed the site itself, call it self-immolation, if you will. All it was doing was using that as a chip in what it considered the preliminary negotiations, which is what North Korea loves to do. It also destroyed Yongbyon, you will recall, its most dangerous because it was a plutonium producer and reprocessing facility in the 2000s. That didn't deter its development of nuclear weapons one whit. It still developed nuclear weapons that it now has. It still developed ballistic missiles that it now has. These are all ceremonial moves by North Korea. And I might add very importantly, I think, these are moves programmed well in advance by North Korea, unlike the moves of the US administration, which are dreamed up out of Trump's mind moments before he sits down and begins to talk. Just talk to the people from the White House who will tell you that they had to scramble murderously post-Trump announcement of the summit to even begin to try and put a package together, and then had great difficulty doing it as they approached the actual date of the summit. So North Korea has scripted all of these steps. They were going to take the steps anyway, or they are steps that are innocuous to them in terms of their strategic objectives. So North Korea has won everything up to this point. And to your original point about my position on the peninsula, that has nothing to do with negotiations. If you are going to sit down and you're going to negotiate from the position, from the foundation that Trump created by his bellicose remarks and his other rather undiplomatic statements and so forth, then you better come to the thing and begin to win from the very start, because you don't have much distance to go, while North Korea, as it has proven many times in the past, has lots of distance to cover and lots of things to do in that distance. You look like a fool every time North Korea winds up not doing what you ask them to do or put something ceremonial forth rather than something substantive. And you look even more like a fool when you put substantive things forth that North Korea has wanted for some time. I'm really worried about this process having no real strategic rationale behind it, other than, and this is a frightening prospect, other than they want to get to the point where North Korea does do something that's readily identifiable as deal stopping. And then we have an impasse where Trump has no other alternative but to say, well, we're back where we were before. And where we were before was very close to war.
Okay, but I guess where I might differ from you here, though, is this notion that the status quo ante is preferable to Trump being a whimsical deal maker here, as strange as that sounds. Because in this case, because
you're not getting my point, Aaron. My point
yeah.
is that we've been here before, first. Second, Kim really knows how to go here and how to move out from here. And third, what we have done to this point is change a strategy that Trump liked to call strategic patience, that I like to call keeping the peace or containment, if you will, that did not allow for war for over half a century, from 1953 to the day that Trump was inaugurated. Trump has majorly altered that strategic approach to the Korean Peninsula. First, by bellicose, almost idiotic and moronic, psychopathic even statements about Kim Jong-un and about the situation there. And now by using that leverage, if that's indeed what it is gained, to go to a summit in Singapore and do something no other president has ever done, though Bill Clinton got very, very close to it. That's only fortuitous for the United States if there's a strategy for follow-up that actually produces peace on the peninsula. Peace, Aaron, that we've had for over half a century. We're jeopardizing that peace right now if there's not a strategy, if what we're going to do is move down the road to a place where Kim finally has to be called out, reveals that he's never going to get rid of his nuclear weapons, let alone his chemical and biological, never going to stop ballistic missile development, resumes all of those things in a way that's blatant, and we don't have any choice but to go to war.
Okay, but what you call peace, I think, is misleading, because there never was an official end to the Korean War. There was just an armistice, and so the U.S. and North Korea have been. had been
Then there was an
officially
end.
at war for Colonel. If I can finish my question, the U.S. and North Korea have been officially at war for decades. That's seen the rise of the U.S. nuclear presence on the peninsula and also these military exercises. All of this prompted North Korea to develop a nuclear weapons program that didn't have before,
All this
leading to a
kept the
very
peace. All this
leading
kept
to
the peace too.
well, but peace, you'll agree, was a very dangerous situation. And so now you have Trump breaking with the Washington playbook, meeting with North Korea, freezing military exercises, which I know you favored before.
Yes.
I don't get why that is as troubling. And by the way, the foundation in which this is taking place in terms of concessions on both sides is not just a foundation built by Trump. There's also a foundation, I think, from the North Koreans' point of view, which should be noted, which is that decades ago, the U.S. destroyed a large part of the country with a massive bombing, killing a sizable proportion of the population. Then you have the nuclear buildup. Then you have this deal under the Bush administration where there was a chance there of real progress. The U.S. was supposed to help provide a light water reactor. It reneged on that and killed the agreement and reimposed sanctions. So North Korea is coming from a place it's not a blank slate. They're coming from a place of mistrust. So if the U.S. to show some goodwill and just temporarily suspend some war games, I don't see why that's a bad thing.
Well, I don't see it's a bad thing either. I just don't think that's what's going to happen. You have trust, you have reliance in this administration, Aaron, that I simply do not have, period.
So I certainly don't trust this administration, but I certainly trust Trump's, or I have more faith in Trump at least wanting the public relations win of peace, which he seems to at least be trying for here, than I do hopefully winning out over people like John Bolton, who have long tried to undermine peace.
There's another principle, if you will, operating here, though, that is underlying all of this, and it's covered in Michael Glennon's book about the national security state and double government. There is an element within U.S. institutional architecture that simply does not, one, want to leave the peninsula, two, and it has strategic reason for that. It has nothing to do with North Korea. It has everything to do with China and the defense of Japan and the military-industrial complex and the four-star position for the Army on the Korean Peninsula. All of that bureaucratic reason for staying is operating. Second, I'm not so sure that that bureaucratic reason operating the way it is wouldn't welcome some sort of fracas on the peninsula more than it would the ousting of the United States permanently from the peninsula. This is something that Trump is completely unaware of, and even John Bolton, as I know from my own conversations with the man, is not cognizant of to the extent that he should be, and disregards to an alarming sense. So there's so many other things operating here, including, I haven't even mentioned the interests of Prime Minister Abe and ultimately the Japanese self-defense forces and ultimately Beijing as well. There's so much operating here that Trump and his team seem to be utterly ignorant of as they seek simply TV highlights, that it's very disturbing to see what's happening and to understand all this as backdrop. All I'm saying is, yes, there are some moves here of which I've been in favor for a long time, including ultimately perhaps a diminution of, if not an outright withdrawal from the U.S. presence in Korea. But that's something that's got to be done very carefully and in concert with our allies, principally Japan and South Korea. I don't see that happening here. And I know John Bolton very, very well. I don't see it happening. I don't see John being in favor of it. And just him throwing out chemical and biologicals, which I haven't even heard before, means that he's well beyond Trump on what he wants from the North Koreans. And I know the North Koreans, they are not going to give up any of these things. So where are we 6 months down the road when it becomes clear that they're not going to do so? And yet we're still standing there demanding irretrievable, confirmable, reliable, all the things that we have said and Bolton just added to in terms of what Kim has to surrender in order to meet our demands.
Okay. In terms of our allies, let me ask you a question, though. You mentioned the need to work with Japan and South Korea. But isn't that not a contradiction? Because, certainly South Korea has favored this process. The government is the one that spearheaded it.
And the government in power right now.
And the majority, Right, and the majority of the people support it. Japan, though, the government there feels very differently. Japan, at least from the way I see it, has been not been so supportive of this process and maybe trying to undermine it.
I think it's more complex than that. I think Prime Minister Abe and the LDP in particular, and to a certain extent, the Japanese elite, if you will, are looking at this with real concern. First, because they liked Trump in the beginning, they always like Republicans, and they always warm to bellicosity if it's aimed at their purpose and their interest. But now they're having some concerns, some deep concerns. They're even hedging their bets. I would be willing to guarantee you that there's a plan right now on Abe's desk for a fully up nuclear power called Japan, and that they're looking hard at it. They're very concerned about what they see as less than strategic operations by the United States from this administration vis-a-vis North Korea, and for that matter, vis-a-vis China. Let's just look at what's happening right now in that regard alone, this narrow little regard, which is nonetheless important. China's already started to back off its enforcement of the sanctions against North Korea, and nothing really has happened except the meeting. So what's happening with this third visit of Kim to Beijing? I'll guarantee you China is consulting with Kim about what they're going to do further on. And all this trade business right now is disincentivizing China in some really major ways to be cooperative with the U.S. versus being cooperative with Kim, or more so with Kim than the U.S. So it looks like an absolutely uncoordinated approach to the problem, whether you're looking at the alienating trade practices, almost amounting to a trade war, or you're looking at the lack of substance from the Singapore summit. I'm just alarmed that we're going to go down this road and get to some juncture where Trump is going to be desperate and he's going to have to regain some ground. And he's going to do that by returning to the more bellicose policies that he commenced this thing with.
I take your point, and it's a really interesting way to look at it. It's in this time of shifting stances where you have Democrats leading the charge against the prospects for peace and opposing the suspension of war games, and Trump trying to paint himself as a peacemaker. It's a bizarre time, and we really appreciate it.
You put your finger on something that just appalls me with the Democrats out there. You know, maybe you interpreted my position that way initially. But I'm not like the Democrats who say, let's don't have peace, simply because it's politically unpalatable for me, for this Republican to have peace. I'm all for peace. I just don't see the kind of expertise and genius being exercised here that might bring it.
On that, we'll leave it there. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, now a distinguished professor at the College of William & Mary. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.